Hey, welcome back everyone. First off, some breaking news. The floods in China are growing more serious and they're now impacting at least 17.7 million people. So far in these floods in 26 provinces and regions across southern China, there are high alerts on 309 rivers and 45 of the rivers have exceeded their flood protections. Of them, 12 of these rivers have surpassed historical flood levels. The Chinese Communist Party, meanwhile, has been censoring some of the information around the floods, and so the numbers on it are never fully trustworthy. But current statistics say that around 119 people have died or have gone missing, and about 848,000 have been evacuated, 15,000 homes were destroyed, and the economic cost is around 39.3 billion yuan, or around $5.5 billion. And the disasters are ongoing. State-run news outlet Xinhua published a warning on July 6 of a megaflood in the lower and middle reaches of the Yangtze River. And mudslides caused by the heavy rains on July 2nd in Zhangjiajie washed away homes and washed away a school with students in it. Local reports from CiLi County, where this happened, say that around dozens of homes were destroyed and at least 10 people were still missing, but details are still unconfirmed. And the floods are just part of the series of natural disasters hitting China right now. A report published on Weibo, a Chinese social network, by several Chinese agencies, including the Ministry of Emergency Management, saying that in the first half of 2020 they faced floods, hailstorms, earthquakes, forest fires, droughts, low temperature freezing, and many other disasters that more than double the deaths and economic damage caused by the floods alone. In addition to this, China now has cases of the Bubonic Plague, the Black Death, which hit Europe previously in the Middle Ages, which was recently confirmed in Inner Mongolia. And this adds to the resurgence of the new coronavirus in Beijing and other parts of China, and to reports as well of a new type of swine flu that Chinese scientists say has a pandemic potential. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, the Chinese Communist Party's State Council announced on July 3rd that Zhangjiajie will serve as the first director of the Hong Kong National Security Agency, in charge of implementing these new national security laws. And many people are taking this as a sign of coming tough repression in Hong Kong. Zhang is the Secretary General of the Guangdong Provincial Party Committee, and he is known for brutally carrying out the repression of the, quote, Wukong rights defense protests. That was in the siege of Wukong, where multiple villagers were arrested, and it resulted in the bloodiest public incident in China in recent years. The Chinese Communist Party also sent around 300 troops from its paramilitary People's Armed Police to Hong Kong to supervise the police. And Japan's Kyodo News reported that they were assigned from Guangdong province, where Zhang is from, suggesting he's sending some of his own forces there for this. And in Hong Kong, where these new national security laws have been implemented, which effectively ends Hong Kong's autonomy from the mainland, various forms of censorship are also now being instated that are in line with Chinese Communist Party policies. Local authorities have banned a protest statement that said, "Liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times." And the Leisure and Cultural Services Department told Hong Kong to remove, quote, sensitive books from its libraries. Close to 400 books have now been removed from libraries in Hong Kong, and these include writings on political opinion, such as from Hong Kong protest leader Joshua Wong and others. And meanwhile, an important question to ask with Hong Kong. While Hong Kong is right on the precipice of facing human rights abuses from the Chinese Communist Party as it begins to implement its own system of law in what was supposed to be a democratic-run country. And so this raises a few questions. If the world allows Hong Kong to fall to the Chinese Communist Party, which country is next? If the world does not draw a line in the sand, which country is next? Already we see China having these border conflicts with India. Already we see them becoming more aggressive in the South China Sea. We see them doing flyovers of Taiwan. We see different border conflicts, different aggressive statements, and we now see them eliminating the agreement they had with Hong Kong. We see them putting in this individual, this person known for human rights abuses, going into Hong Kong to take control of the implementation of these national security laws in Hong Kong. If the world allows Hong Kong to fall to this, if they do not act, if they do not put sanctions in place, for example, which country is next? Well, we can say that on the Chinese Communist Party's agenda, a few things are already prominent. One is the retaking of Taiwan, for example. Another is the, say, further push into the South China Sea, for example. Another one is the taking of this border region with India, for example. And this also includes many parts within China where the Chinese Communist Party is brutally persecuting its own people. And so again, what does this tell us about the Chinese Communist Party's global ambitions? And what message is the world sending the Chinese Communist Party if it allows it to do so without facing sanctions? If it allows it to do so without being pushed back against? This is a major question to ask as we go forward. First off, how China is influencing news outlets around the world. Now, the International Federation of Journalists did a study based on 58 journalist unions around the world, and they showed the, quote, multi-layered approach that China is taking to reshape the global news agenda. And the study, quote, indicates the significant role and wide-ranging impact of China's moves to extend its influence through these initiatives, including journalism exchange programs, union cooperation, content sharing, training programs, media acquisition, and promulgation of China's grand infrastructure scheme, the Belt and Road Initiative. And so in other words, China is using all of these systems to influence media in all parts of the world, not just the United States, but everywhere. Now, of these unions they spoke with, a third of them said they were approached by or were in discussions with Chinese journalist unions. And of those, about a third had memoranda of understanding with these Chinese unions. Now, the IFJ data, this report says, also shows that China is conducting a media outrage campaign in almost every continent, equally targeting both developed and developing countries. And it says the report, quote, clearly illustrates how China's media is increasing its global footprint in the world's media, and its strategy showed clear signs of targeting journalists to outsource its influence, as it says. It also shows how the Chinese Communist Party is buying influence in news outlets. The report says this, quote, Chinese companies are more and more, quote, buying boats, it's one of the Chinese Communist Party's terms, or, quote, building them, by taking stakes in existing legacy companies or setting up digital joint ventures overseas. And this is according to the report again. And it adds, while focusing on developing countries, Beijing continues to offer sponsored trips to China for senior journalists from strategic developing countries like Australia, where the All China Journalist Association has organized programs, including a program with the Australian-China Relations Institute at University of Technology, Sydney, that has brought at least 28 Australian journalists to China since 2016. And in some of the research that I've done myself, this is true also in the United States, where they've also targeted major news outlets in very much the same way. The Chinese Communist Party runs programs under its state-run news outlet Xinhua, running programs just like this for American journalists. And the report says this also, quote, the results have, in many cases, produced stories that faithfully echo Beijing's position on issues ranging from the South China Sea to technological developments in China. And so what does that mean? It means the Chinese Communist Party has open programs targeting journalists around the world. They're going after unions of senior journalists, unions of journalists in different countries, targeting them, offering them trips to China, bringing them on these propaganda tours, and instilling them with the Chinese Communist Party's view on different issues that it cares about. And so many different news outlets that say, oh, have you been to China? Have you gone to China? Well, if they've gone to China, chances are they've been brought there through one of these programs. And if they've gone to these programs, they've been indoctrinated with the Chinese Communist Party's different narratives on these select issues. Also from The Guardian here, China is reshaping the global news landscape and weakening the Fourth Estate. It says this, kindergartens, handicraft markets, high-tech companies, hydroelectric dams, political indoctrination camps. These are some of the sites international journalists are whisked around when they take part in all-expense paid tours in China. The motive of these invitations is, in the mantra of the Chinese President Xi Jinping, to, quote, tell a good China story to the outside world. In the past, that good China story would have been told through clumsy Communist Party propaganda broadcasts on its state-run news outlets. But during our research for the International Federation of Journalists, which is based on this report I just mentioned, we found that Beijing is increasingly outsourcing the storytelling of foreign journalists, who often end up amplifying its messages in their own languages, in the pages of their own news outlets. And it says that more than 120 U.S. journalists have also been on such tours, as well as 28 Australian journalists. And so this brings up the question again, what are the sources of the different news outlets feeding you stories on China? And even if they appear to be grassroots reporting, even if they appear to be done as, say, journalists going to China and getting a first-hand look, who is organizing those trips? Who is the one bringing them on these trips? I've said it before. For a lot of journalists who travel to China to report, they're living in the Truman Show. Everything around them is fake. They're being shown a false reality, and it is the false reality that China wants to show the world. Now we should be clear, for the Chinese Communist Party, control of information like this is a military program. They run it under what they call the three warfares doctrine. The three warfares are media warfare, legal warfare, and psychological warfare. Media warfare would be exactly things like this: controlling or influencing outlets of information. Legal warfare would be controlling, say, international institutions of law. And psychological warfare is things that target people like you, people like me. Psychological warfare is changing the way you interpret information. And so when the Chinese Communist Party takes these journalists and brings them on these tours and shows them the reality it wants them to report, it is giving them these psychological warfare doctrine, say, templates that support the worldview of the Chinese Communist Party, so that when people hear about things like the South China Sea, when people hear about things like Hong Kong, when they hear about the different human rights abuses in China, they will interpret it through the lens of the Chinese Communist Party's arguments justifying such actions. And even when a lot of journalists try to act impartial, when they try to be balanced on issues like this, and they're not actually looking at the facts and trying to show you what's really happening, they will be feeding you these disinformation narratives of the CCP. And how does disinformation work? Disinformation works exactly through things like this. It is what the Chinese Communist Party would call the borrowed boat strategy. You want to use someone else's boat. You use someone else's news outlet. You use an established, say, credible appearing news outlet to carry your narratives for you. Because were these same narratives stated through some of these, say, state-run news outlets, as The Guardian pointed out actually, then it would be seen as propaganda from the CCP itself, not as, according to some people, credible news reporting from major news outlets. And for the Chinese Communist Party, ideology is important, because as far as they're concerned, social stability is based on ideology. The Chinese people not revolting against what they see the CCP doing against them is based on ideology. The international community not sanctioning China for its abuses of its own people is based on ideology. And also for the Chinese Communist Party, ideology ties into its international influence. How do countries regard China? Will China get sanctioned for its different policies? All of this is based on the control of information. And for them, this is a major strategic agenda. Now moving on, China is using its tongs to give the illusion of grassroots support for its new Hong Kong law. Now China Daily said this: as of 11 p.m. on Monday, and that was last week, 593,797 overseas Chinese from about 160 associations had signed the petition endorsing the law. Now, if you were to read this report, let's say in China Watch, in one of these mainstream news outlets that publishes it, or if you were to read China Daily, say on the Hill, and they do distribute to Washington to influence our politicians, if you were to read this, here's what most people at least would think. They would either think maybe China's promoting some propaganda, right? Or they would think, grassroots support among Chinese for this law. Maybe some Chinese support this law. Here's what it's really about. It says these Chinese associations, 160 associations. And if you read the text of the report, what it actually says, it names these associations. These associations are not grassroots. These associations are not independent. These associations are the Tongs. And the Chinese Communist Party controls many of these Tongs. And so in other words, here's what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. It's using its control of these Chinese fraternal organizations in different parts of the world and having them sign these declarations supporting this national security law to give the illusion that the Chinese people abroad support what it is doing. And that is not the case. Many of these organizations push the CCP's agendas in overseas communities, and the Chinese Communist Party manages these organizations through its United Front Work Department. Also in other news, China is building mansions for foreign government officials in its push for influence. War on the Rocks had a great report on this. It said this, quote, "Last year, the world's fifth least developed country, Burundi, inaugurated a $22 million presidential palace. In Zimbabwe, whose economy the World Bank believes contracted by nearly 8% last year, a 6-story, $100 million parliament building is nearing completion. The Liberian government, which oversees the world's 9th least developed country, is adding 2 new annexes to its Capitol building and a new ministerial complex. The $66 million combined cost of the project equals more than 2% of Liberia's 2019 GDP. All of these buildings, and many more across the continent, were gifts from the Chinese government. When the Chinese Communist Party wants to infiltrate a country, it will manipulate the local systems. It has a different model for every country. In Latin America, many parts of Africa, and many parts of, say, Asia, it does this through local bribery. It will bribe local officials. It will build presidential mansions. It will give them backdoor deals. It will give them access to, say, business deals with the CCP. If you see U.S. officials travel to China and come back with, say, deals with the Chinese Communist Party, either for themselves or with family members, this should set off a red flag, because this is what they do in every part of the world. This is how the Chinese Communist Party buys off officials. Now moving on, is Taiwan being discriminated against by the European Union? Now, a few stories on this. Reuters reported that the European Union has excluded the United States from its safe travel list, but it is including China on its safe travel list if the Chinese authorities give similar access to the European Union. Taiwan, meanwhile, has been excluded from the safe travel list, according to Focus Taiwan. And this is after Taiwan has had 80 days without a single local virus case. And as mainland China is talking about a resurgence of the virus. And so on what basis is the European Union opening up travel to China while closing down travel to Taiwan and the United States? Now with that said, folks, we're again broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, so be sure to tune in. Also, if you're on YouTube, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, we really need your support. And also, if you want to support this channel, we do have a Patreon group, so please join our team on Patreon. You can find the link to that in the description below. And also for our Patreon supporters, we'll be doing a live Q&A every Sunday, so be sure to tune in for that as well. And of course, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.